So aside from using sounds that work well together, there's one other essential step that's used in the layering process, and that is the use of EQ. Now, I'm not going to explain what an EQ does. I'm not going to give you a crash course on it. So if you don't know what an EQ is, you have no idea what it is, or you just need to brush up on terminology and all that, then I recommend doing a bit of research and a bit of reading or watch a few tutorials before coming back to this course, because layering does require, a basic knowledge of EQ and how it's used. What I am going to explain though is the application of EQ in the process of layering and why it's so fundamentally important. Now, the first thing to note is that there are two main uses of EQ, corrective and creative. The corrective use of EQ is used to fix up problems such as frequency masking, which I'm going to explain in a moment. And the latter, the creative use of EQ, is used to tweak sounds, to change them, mangle them, and just generally shape them to what you want to hear. So, frequency masking, what is it? Frequency masking is a result of two or more sounds sharing the same space in the frequency spectrum. Now, a good example of this in everyday life is when you're trying to talk to someone in a crowded space, say a coffee shop or at a concert or something like that. Because there are a lot of people talking around you, it's hard to make out what the other person is saying at times, simply because there are so many other people speaking in the same frequency range or similar frequency range. And this happens in music as well. If you've got a piano, which takes up a vast sort of area of the frequency spectrum, and you try to lay a ton of other sounds that have equal weight and equal volume, harmonics and different parts of sounds will disappear and get crowded and so on. And the main problem with frequency masking, other than it sounding really bad, is that elements will sound different than they do in isolation as certain harmonics are being masked. So for example, you might stack two or three sounds together, two or three layers, and you might wonder where the mid-end of your pluck went, or the rich low part of your super saw, the parts of the sound that really sounded good when you play them in isolation, and they disappear when played in context and played in relation to everything else. So EQ helps us work around this, as it allows us to remove the parts that aren't as necessary or are better done by other elements. For example, you might find when layering, say, a pluck in super saw, that you prefer the low end on your pluck compared to the low end or the low mid on your super saw. But the mid and high on your super saw you like more than the mid and high on your pluck. So you would EQ accordingly. You would take out the low end of your super saw, and you would take out some of the mid and high on your pluck to achieve a more cohesive sound. Now, most of the time, you're going to have a fundamental sound. Even if you're layering to create a new sound in the creation application like we talked about in the last video, you're always going to have a fundamental sound, the sound that you start with. So even if you are creating a completely new sound from two or more layers, you're always going to start with one sound. And what you want to do is EQ around that existing layer. Just because it's much easier and it's a lot more of a logical approach to trying to just make two things fit at the same time. Now, this doesn't mean that you don't EQ your existing layer. You should EQ your existing layer most of the time. But it just means that you're looking at it as trying to make this new layer fit or fill in the gaps of that existing one. And prioritization, so does this second layer do a certain thing better? Does it have a better high end than the original layer? And if so, should I take the high end out of that first initial layer? So it's just thinking like that. So that is the corrective use of EQ. It's getting rid of frequency masking problems, and it's just making it sound a bit more clean. But there is another use of EQ, the creative use. And the creative use of EQ and layering is to achieve chemistry and coherency between two or more sounds. And this is where you're EQing in a creative, musical manner. to make things sound more cohesive or as one. For example, you might only want to use the high end of a clap when layering it with other claps, not particularly because of frequency masking. It might sound fine when it's not EQ'd, but simply because you prefer how it sounds when the low end is removed. Or in another case, you might only want to use the body, the mids of the piano, and not the low or high end. Not because of any frequency masking problems or mix problems, but simply because you like how it sounds like that. And again, this is an artistic use of EQ, and there aren't really any rules surrounding it. And this is not essential like frequency masking is. You don't need to do it. You don't need to EQ in this fashion. But it's something we do because we're artists, because we make music, and because we're creative. So, whenever you're using EQ, whether it's in a creative or corrective manner, you must remember to think about the sound holistically rather than just its individual parts. Just because your pluck sounds thin and weak by itself, it doesn't mean that it won't work in the context of other elements. So I hope that made sense, and I look forward to seeing you in the next video.